Okay, so in preparation for this, I decided to read the short story on which it is based, A Change of Plan, which is well worth your time and is very short, which is good. And there's a moment towards the end of it at the wedding reception when the father of the bride says to our hero, in inverted commas, "The first time you came up to us, and now here we are. I think it's great though, kind of thing you see in the movies." And obviously this has ended up becoming a movie. Do you think the fact that Neil Simon was adapting someone else's work makes this kind of his best screenplay or one of his better screenplays?
I genuinely think, as somebody who's made movies with my husband, I think that collaborations really help to limit the symptomatic aspects of artists. Artists have their symptoms that come out very compulsively in their works. And when they collaborate, somebody says something about those symptoms. You know what? In the case of my husband, sex is a thing for you. And maybe we could just do something about that a little bit because it's coming over a bit aggressively or whatever and so on. The symptomatic aspects of an artist's work do sometimes become funnier and lighter when there's collaboration. But I think what's extraordinary in this collaboration where Neil Simon has adapted a screenplay from somebody else and then Elaine May is directing it is that the repetition that is the mainstay of comedy. So comedy is always, in part, about taking words, repeating them, doing callbacks until the words begin to mean something else, until they take on new meanings. The repetition is a real theme in this film, and somehow those repetitions from the writer to Neil Simon to Elaine May gives a kind of depth and treatment to the language and meanings of this film that makes new meanings come in until we get at the end, I think, an extraordinarily, I would say this is a feminist film. And it's a feminist film certainly written by Neil Simon, who was not in most of his work, I would say, a feminist screenwriter.
Yeah, I think a lot of his stuff is these days feels a bit stale and kind of stagey and of its time. I went to see the Matthew Broderick, Sarah Jessica Parker thing in town, and it feels like a period piece in a way that this doesn't. And obviously a huge amount of that has to be down to Elaine May, because this is sort of the one in his filmography where that isn't the case. I mean, obviously, something that you've written about a lot, you've written 2 books about it, is Jewishness. And clearly, you know, almost all of the major creative forces, from the writer who wrote the original short story, Neil Simon, Elaine May, Charles Grodin, Jeannie Berlin, you know, they're all Jewish. You know, Sybil Shepherd, obviously not.
Obviously.
Obviously not. But, like, how common would that have been at the time, and how much do you think that the humour of this film is particularly Jewish?
I think that, again, this it really, I would associate it again with the woman, the sort of the woman's humour. I mean, I'm conscious that the season is about female comedy and women having a reputation for not being funny, but being, of course, very funny. At the beginning of this film, we see our hero. He's not our hero. I don't know what he's a kind of hero. Lenny looking at himself in the mirror and saying hi, and so we have our Narcissus, and of course the way in which female comics have often subverted male comedy is through Echo, the Narcissus and the Echo. But the Echo comes back, and again, the words are changed. And the next thing we see him after his high is he's with Lila, and she's laughing about something hilariously, and it's something to do with pizza. And he a little late, pretends he gets the joke. And then later we see him with Kelly. She's laughing about something. She says her father bought her this laugh. And he pretends he gets the joke. Constantly we see him pretending to get the joke, but he never gets the joke. He's never in on the joke. This is a film in which the main protagonist is the butt of the joke. And at the same time, it's a story about the Jewish man who wants very much, I mean, hovering over this film is the Carpenter song, Close to You, and wants to come close to the American dream, to the idea of the trophy wife, of seizing whatever it is that America seems to promise. And he says he's a very determined man, but he's never really in on the joke. At some point he says, I'm laying my cards on the table and there's not a joker in the pack. And of course, that's the point. There's not a joker in his pack. He's not in on his own jokes. Every line is written for him. And every script is pre-scripted for him. Whereas the women seem to be having some kind of fun and some kind of good time that he's not in on, and that in some ways it's a sort of meta-narrative about the Jewish experience, I think, of assimilation in America.
Yeah, I mean, related to that, I mean, I ask this as a man with a blonde Gentile wife who feels very connected to his own Jewishness. Do you see the film as ultimately being about assimilation? Because for me, the tragedy of his character, and there is a tragedy there, is that clearly in the first instance, he's done what was expected of him, what his parents would have been happy, you know, and also partly because he wanted to have sex with her. He's married Jeannie Berlin's character, and by the end of the film, you know, he's blown it all up to do this other thing, and he is left by himself. The kids won't even chat to him, and it hasn't worked. He's not got a place there either, and it feels like something is being said about his attempts to fit in that aren't working.
No, he's won the battle and lost the war. He's arrived and he's absolutely nowhere. He's marooned on a floral sofa. He's a very determined young man, and that determination we slowly come to realize, and I think he never really quite gets the joke, is that he's been predetermined. He's not in any sense driving his own story. And so the story of assimilation is very subtly encoded, I think, in this movie and throughout. There is, I think, what we would now today call something about, we would call it today maybe white supremacy or something like that, although he's coded as a kind of... He's coded as a New Yorker and as a damned newlywed, with that new, I think, smacking of something inauthentic, of not old money and old school and so on. But when Kelly jokes with him, that's my spot on the beach, that's my stall at the bar, she's saying, I own this place, I own this world. And it's a real claim, actually, she's made. And what the brilliance of this film and all the best comedies is it's never a joke. The jokes are never jokes. Everything that seems like a joke, that reads as a joke, is literally the case. And so that is her spot on the beach. This is, compared to him, when you first see her, she is the sun. She is as potent and as powerful as the sun. Meantime, his wife is sunburnt, and then later one of the repetitions is he's sunburnt too, and none of them can sort of take this sort of these sort of rays, this sort of power. And then by the time he has sort of made he's made his case to the father who eats determination for breakfast, we realize that he's just repeating lines. He's talking about originality, at getting back to basics, about getting back to nature. We know he's read this in the Minnesota Star, and none of the lines are his own. He's looking less and less like an honest cauliflower, and seems to be very much in a situation of inauthenticity, the authenticity he claims to be after. But the real joke, and I think this is what makes it a very Jewish film, is that, of course, they're in Minnesota, they're in Minneapolis. What are those names? Those names are not. Those names refer back to the real. I mean, these are not the original people in Minnesota and Minneapolis. Those names allude to the Native Americans who have been uprooted and transplanted as well by these. So nobody is an original here. Nobody really owns the story, and so that is, I think, one of the traumatic truths inside this Jewish comedy.
Yeah, and it's very telling that, you know, we get told that she tells him that my dad didn't like your face, basically, and then they move to a different hotel that there is an insinuation about whether he would be welcome in that hotel, which is he wouldn't be welcome. And the interesting thing is, in the story ends with a very big joke that is not in the film. And I think obviously the title of the story is A Change of Plan, and it's really about his libido. So in the final scene, where he does end up exactly the same way getting married to her, the final moment is he realizes he fancies the new mother-in-law. And it's just this sort of like horrible, grim joke that he's just going to keep falling for people and he's keep going to do this. But, you know, between Simon and May, they take it into a very, very different area. I was going to ask you, do you see the influence of this film many places today? I mean, I found a video online where Jerry Seinfeld said it is the greatest comedy film ever made. And I think there's a lot of George Costanza in the Grodin character, who his ability to lie that quickly and that easily. Very often in comedy films, part of the joke will be someone's trying to lie and they can't do it very effectively. And here he just gets it out. And I'm sure, I know Larry David was the main driving force behind that character, but clearly Seinfeld is a very big fan of this film as well. Do you see it elsewhere, the influence of this film?
I found myself thinking when watching it this time about Nora Ephron. And I mean, obviously the famous scene in the diner where I'll have what she's having is there's an if you've seen Elaine May's A New Leaf, which apparently is playing somewhere else just after this, which she made she scripted herself, and which came out just the year before. It's an astonishing film. I love it so much. And Henrietta in that movie is constantly covered in food and mess and so on. And the Walter Matthau character Henry is, whilst intending to kill her, also would quite like to tidy her up in the meantime whilst he's still married to her, picking things off her. And of course, in this movie, we see in the diner, we see the idea of the woman of appetite and the woman of desire. She's covered in egg salad. If you're going to be with me for the next 40 to 50 years, you're going to have to get used to this. I'm going to be covered in egg salad. Reputedly, Elaine May was always covered in food and foodstuffs in one way or another, and this is her daughter playing. In this movie, Elaine May plays the female lead in A New Leaf. These are alter egos of characters who are, in a way, the female Schlemiel to the George Costanza. These are women who get to be not picture perfect, and I think the contention of this kind of cinema is, and of course this was a problem for May in life, that women were meant to be picture perfect and their films were meant to be picture perfect. They weren't meant to take risks. They were meant to be smooth. They were meant to be uncracked. If a woman made a mistake in her appearance or in her cinema, then she didn't get to carry on and she didn't get to keep the guy and so on. But this is I think the genius of this thing is she refuses these laws of perfection, and somehow other possibilities arise. And one of the main things you feel in this film is the terror. I mean, there's that very famous Margaret Atwood line that women are very afraid that men will kill them, and men are very afraid that women will laugh at them. And this is, I think, these are the films in which you feel that coming into being, that in the case of A New Leaf, the plan is to kill her. In the case of this film, there's a sort of version of getting rid of the wife. But the real fear in the film is that everybody's laughing, and he's trying to catch up with the joke. So I've totally lost the plot, and I can't remember where that began. Where did that begin?
You alluded to something which is the main thing I really want to ask you about Elaine May, which is she obviously makes 2 films in 2 years, 71 and 72. She then makes Mikey and Nicky, and then in 1987, so 16 years after her first one, she makes Ishtar. and that's it. She made 4 films. There are no more. There was a sort of documentary thing about Mike Nichols, who was her double act partner. Doesn't really count. 4 feature films, no more. Basically deemed to be difficult in inverted commas. What do you make of that fact, given the amount of her contemporaries who've been allowed to churn out quite a lot of crap for decades?
I feel that we've been cheated. I mean, this was a woman who could have made so many great movies and so many subtle movies. I really feel we've been cheated, and she had a reputation. No, the people. I mean, they said she was difficult. Well, if that's of course what you have to be if you're going to be an auteur director. If you're not difficult, no one's going to take you seriously as an auteur director. So I imagine she was difficult. I imagine she is difficult, and that is very much par for the course in this kind of job. So she also, I think, had a lot of ambivalence. She wanted to do different things in her career. She certainly never wanted to be interviewed. She didn't want to be famous. That was part of the things all wrong. But I think she had big plans for cinema, and she wasn't permitted to carry on with them. Also, the films that were critically panned were good. They weren't bad films. They just weren't picture perfect. They had, in comedy, the whole job is to get your audience cracking up. And you can only really get them cracking up if you have those cracks in the work itself. It should never be too smooth. If you really want to make a dent in the world, you've got to get rid of these kinds of laws of how you do things. And I think she was really doing that. So I'm heartbroken. I'm the heartbroken kid. No, I really am heartbroken that we don't have more Elaine May films.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ishtar, it's interesting. I finally saw it a few years ago, and it has become a punchline. It is considered one of the worst films ever made. And you watch it, I don't think it's great. I wouldn't quite reclaim it as actually this film is a masterpiece, but it's no worse than hundreds of other films of its type. It's just a lot of money was spent on it, and she wasn't allowed to make that mistake in a way that lots of other people have been. And I read an interview with Gary Larson, who does the Far Side cartoons, and he used it as a punchline, like the idea that it was the worst film ever made. I can't remember exactly what the cartoon was. And he said years later he saw it on an aeroplane, and he issued an apology saying, it's not that bad, it's all right. I went along with what everyone said, and it really seemed to stick to her. And look, she's had an amazing career. She's still acting. She won a Tony Award not that long ago, but we should have got 15, 20 films out of her.
Well, Mike Nichols has had this amazing career, and we were just saying this before, that this movie is the sequel really to The Graduate. The Graduate, I think, came out in 1967, and you remember at the end of The Graduate, you have the young couple, blank face, on the back seat of a bus, looking ahead to the future with the sort of what next? Okay, well, I've won again. The trophy wife has, the wife has been won. The prize, the determined young man has got what he wants, and now he's sitting on the back seat. And now what? And you see that right after the wedding ceremony, at the first scene of this film. There's a kind of looking up. And now what? And this is the arena of the happy ever after that very few artists or writers have really dared to look at or to examine or to film. Most of the wedding plots take us up to the wedding and no further. So this is the arena that she's moved us into, taking over from Mike Nichols, who went on to make many other films that are justly celebrated. But she's doing the difficult work, I think.
Just before we take it to questions from the audience, I'd just like to give a shout out to another film that is showing as part of the season, which I think does have some similarities with this, which is Shiver Baby, which it functions in a similar way for me in that it feels like a Rorschach test where a Jew kind of sees it as a horror film and everyone else sees it as a comedy. And that is a superb film, and I know it is being shown here. If anyone has any questions, please fire away. There's one down here.
Hi, thanks. That was a really interesting discussion. In fact, you're talking about the darker side. Elaine May seemed to be attracted to, of course, New Leaf. She originally shot a version with the 2 murders that were in the short story, and Paramount, of course, took out about 45 minutes. So that kind of suggests that she picked up on that dark side of what's actually quite a light-hearted film. I was kind of thinking when you were saying that about what she was attracted to, whether you think that the Lenny character in this is a sociopath. Is he Tom Ripley without the killings, without the murders? Is he basically imitating other people, but trying to get through life like that? And is that a legitimate reading, or have I completely got it wrong?
I don't find him a sociopath. I think maybe I identify with him too much. I think I essentially feel that I myself am perpetually Lenny in the Midwest, just marooned on a floral sofa at some level. But I think he's somebody who feels a certain kind of idea of life has been sold to him. We have the moment where he tries to make the case. He says, "My life is not a game. I don't play games with my life." And then 2 seconds later, he's in a cabin in the mountains saying, "I've always dreamt of playing a game like this all my life." And he can't catch up with himself. What he is a kind of child who's been sold a dream, and in that sense, he's, you want to say, an American, but actually we're all sold that same dream. And what he isn't is what he thinks he is. And this is, so it doesn't make him, I think, a sociopath. Do you find him a sociopath?
I think he can be if you don't go with him. If you see it from other people's point of view, then he's kind of presents some sort of danger to them. It's either a comedy if you see it from his eyes, or it's actually in some ways a weird type of, well, it's horror film in some weird way, I suppose.
Your experiences are, this is the kind of amazing thing about Lenny is there are the moments where he's having to improvise, where he alights on the truth. There's an amazing moment where he's splitting up with his wife, where he says, "I've never felt closer to you." And of course, this theme of closer to you is there. He says, "I've never felt closer to you." And I think he's right. I think they've cracked the script at that moment, and the possibility of real intimacy occurs just there in that moment when they're splitting up. And I mean, the big joke of the film is he's got Sybil Shepherd, who is unbearably beautiful to look at, and you could get sunburnt if you looked at her for too long. You feel that, but Lila's, he should have stuck with Lila's fantastic. With Kelly, he's got to have these honest cauliflowers all his life. With Lila, he gets chocolate bars in bed. He has exotic foods, and actually there is a real compatibility with Lila. I think that there is a sense there that they could have matured into that couple they see in the diner. So I don't think he's a sociopath. I think he's fallen for a dream that can't work. But you think he's a sociopath, then that's fine.
Any other questions?
Yep.
Hi. So the film sort of post-release is kind of its distribution is kind of murky in terms of it's been sort of failed. I was wondering if you had any meditations on, I know, for example, you write a lot about like lost films and forgotten films, and whether you had any meditations on how this film has been failed since its release.
Yeah, so I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it kind of ended up in the hands of a pharmaceutical company. And so I get the sense that Elaine may be far less precious about her work than we are. So I know that A New Leaf did end up getting a decent re-release in the last decade, which has sort of all the bells and whistles on that set. I was actually going to ask Era Philly, who's programmed this season, but I genuinely don't know how it's even able to be screened. It seems like every few years someone will be able to screen this film, but it seems like there's no chance of it getting a kind of DVD or Blu-ray release, which is why it's great that obviously there's 2 screenings here and they're both sold out. I believe there may be another one on the way. But yeah, I all I can say is I just think it's a tragedy. I mean, she only made 4 films. This, there couldn't be any starker kind of contrast between the sort of treatment of men and women in Hollywood than the fact that her literal comedy double act partner, Mike Nichols, made The Graduate. I would say this film stands up as a work of art alongside The Graduate. You might prefer The Graduate, you might prefer this, and that is routinely regarded as one of the greatest films ever made. You can see it any time of day, anywhere, and this is almost impossible to get hold of, and many people haven't even heard of this film, and that just seems like such a shame. But like I say, I get the sense it bothers her less than us. Any others? There's one down here.
I haven't actually seen it myself, but have you seen the remake the Farrelly brothers did of this film?
I avoided it.
No, I haven't. No, has anybody? Yeah.
Oh, one person's owning up.
You're wise to avoid it.
I really.
I'd keep avoiding it.
It didn't feel like a natural fit, and I quite like some of the Farrelly Brothers stuff, but I'm not sure this was the material they should have been dealing with. Any others?
Do you have any information about the relationship between Elaine May and Neil Simon during filming? Was it contentious? Did they haggle over certain parts of the script, or was it relatively smooth?
I believe it was contentious, but I think Devorah knows more about that.
No, I don't know that much, but I know that they had to film. She wasn't allowed to improvise at all. She had to follow his script to the letter. And like I said, I think this is a film about the psychopathy of somebody following a script to the letter, and then if that take didn't work, she then got to improvise. And so I'm pretty sure that Neil Simon didn't write in his script, bearing in mind I've seen A New Leaf and so on, that Lila should be covered in egg salad. I think a lot of the genius of this film are things that probably couldn't have been scripted and wouldn't have been scripted. But yeah, I think he maintained a tight control. It seems that in the New Hollywood, she was the first female film director. It just wasn't the idea of a woman directing you was so peculiar that kind of strange accommodations had to be made. That when she made A New Leaf, seemingly Walter Matthau sort of needed to be there was a sort of, he had to somehow have his say in how he was directed in a way he wouldn't have with other directors, and so I think she probably, but I imagine she just used all of that in the film. That's what I feel the film sort of gives that back to us in a way.
I would also say, I mentioned in the intro, kind of jokingly, the fact that Neil Simon was married 5 times. But actually, this first wife very much seemed to be the one, and she died of cancer very, very young, and he was literally writing this screenplay. So I imagine he was in a pretty grim place at the time of filming this. And so, yeah, if it was contentious, I'm sure his headspace was not a good one. And like I say, I feel like the fact that he was going through that is why we ended up with this film, which doesn't feel like The Odd Couple or The Prisoner of Second Avenue or anything else he ever wrote.
I love The Odd Couple. Do you not love The Odd
I
Couple?
love The Odd Couple, yeah. And The Prisoner of Second Avenue. Any other questions?
I just think it's so unusual for a character to... He gets his way in the end. He doesn't get his comeuppance, really. And I think it was quite shocking the moment you see him walking down the aisle. All of a sudden, there is a wedding going on after the negotiation with the father. And I thought the ending was quite shocking as well, because it feels like it's leading up to something and then it cuts off and it's quite kind of ambiguous. Could you just talk more about that final moments of the movie, the final few scenes, and what your thoughts are on that?
I was 10. I was 10 once, yeah. I mean, in a way, that's the end of The Graduate, except now he's alone. I mean, they're just sort of marooned on a seat with the future ahead of you. This is the terrible spectre of these 40 to 50 years that he felt so taunted by when Lila spoke about them. But these are guys who can sing in the car together, who can have what is necessary for, I think, a good and healthy relationship, which is a quarrel, but he is just in a state of obedience with Kelly and with her father, who seems to have he bought her laugh. So and there are pictures of Kelly all over, and the father wants Kelly too, and we get the sense, therefore, that when after that, and he hasn't accepted the $25,000, that he has Kelly as his wife, that somehow this is the way the father gets to keep his daughter, that his father wants her too. And so somehow, instead of being bought off, he's been bought. And he's considering tear gases as one of his many possible futures. He had a good wife first time. And I think that's what we feel. He got what he wanted, and he didn't know what he wanted. And that's always, I think, the joke in the cinema of masculinity, of men. The idea of the man as someone who knows what he wants led to a kind of ending in which the idea that man's desire is self-evident is refuted in some way.
Yeah, I feel as though, in a sense, I understand exactly what you mean. The first time I saw it, it's just like, how can they possibly be getting married? The father's just tried to buy him off. He said, if you come here again, I'm going to, chuck you over the border, all of that stuff. And for me, having now watched it quite a few times, I think the ending is sadder than that would be. There is some satisfaction for us, I guess, in him getting what he deserves. But for me, ultimately, the film is like the tragedy of this horn dog who, in the opening moments, meets someone who he does fancy, and she says, we can't have sex till we're married, so he gets married to her. Then he is lying on a beach in Miami and he meets Sybil Shepherd in her 20s, and he wants to have sex with her and blows up his life. That is what ultimately he ends up doing, and we are again left with him looking completely morose and miserable, and God knows what's going to happen next for him. Any others?
Just a quick one. The performances in the film are spot on, particularly Charles Grodin. I wonder if you want to speak a bit to that, about the casting and about whether you think they cast the right people and could anyone else have played those roles, and particularly Grodin, because he really looked like he had the leading man chops after that, and really until Midnight Run.
So brilliant, the performances. But again, it's about performativity. So he catches, we see him trying to be himself all the way through the film. And he practices, our first shot of him, he's practicing being himself in the mirror. And then all the rest of the film, we see him attempting to be the idea he has of himself. So it's an acute performance. It's a performance that has to show its own relationship to performance, which is a hard performance to enact. And I think Jeannie Boleyn is absolutely extraordinary. She's also clearly, May had her when she was 17 years old, and so she's May's daughter, and May plays the main character in A New Leaf. But she's May's daughter, but she's very close in age to her own mother, and there's this moment where she says "Mama, Mama" or something, which is the director and the mother and the so on. There's something incredibly naturalistic about her performance, and then the extraordinary thing with Sybil Shepherd is she looks like Sybil Shepherd. And so I think it's a brilliant thing to show her with the sun, because you feel it yourself. You mustn't look at that woman for too long. It's a little threatening.
I also think, the fact that there are sex scenes with Jeannie Boleyn, you watch a film from the 70s, sometimes directed by a man, it's quite an uncomfortable thing. Knowing her mother is behind the camera, I actually think is like really comforting to know. And actually, she's just, she is extraordinary in that role. And again, that's another tragedy. That was her own decision, but she did just stop acting for decades, and then she came back quite recently in Succession. But she, there are decades unaccounted for. I think Grodin is a genuinely sort of genius comedy actor. If you go and watch his old clips with Carsten and stuff, it's just like got a very particular worldview. He just, that persona he perfected. He was doing it on chat shows, and he's doing some variation of it here. I think, Sybil Shepherd is Sybil Shepherd. And then I can't remember his name. Is it Eddie something, the father, Eddie Albert, is superb. You know, it takes a long time for him to even speak. It's done all in his looks, and when he does get to speak and when he does get some monologues, he's just brilliant.
I think he got an Oscar for that role.
Yeah, he did.
What,
Yeah, he is. He's magic. I think everyone just absolutely brings their A game here, from beginning to end, really.
All right. Thank you very much. This was a fascinating conversation. A round of applause again for Devorah and Darren.